Is this working? Okay, if everyone can sit down, then we're going to get started with this session. I am Neil Burgess. I'm from the World Conservation Monitoring Centre in Cambridge in the UK. I will say a few words, and then my main job is to hand over to speakers who will talk about different aspects of spatial planning, country level planning, sub-country level planning, that kind of thing. So that's what we're going to talk about in this session. We kept the door shut for the moment because it's noisy outside. Maybe some people will come in and out, we don't know. But for this session, the general idea is to give people a sense of country, mostly level conservation planning, which links really strongly to both the climate and the biodiversity policies, so the climate COP and the biodiversity, global biodiversity framework that was agreed last December, all have requirements on countries to plan how are they going to use their land, their forests, their agricultural areas for multiple uses, producing food, producing timber, agriculture, climate stabilization, biodiversity, conservation, etc. So we're going to learn more about that in this session. There is a technical thing that we're going to have to all do at a certain point. So one of the presentations is in Bahia, Indonesia, and so probably not many people in the audience will understand that. So there is an automated translation. So if you go to the app and the agenda, and if you find this session, and at the top, and you click on the session, there's a little black box comes up at the top where the live streaming is, and then to the bottom right of the little black box are three little dots. If you press on the three little dots, you can then choose language, and you can choose the language that you want to hear everything in. So that is the way to do it. I suggest that people who want to do that try to do it well before we get to Edison down there when he gives his presentation. So that's what we're going to talk about. After the presentations, we will have a question and answer session. If you have questions, you can submit them again through the system, through Slido into the team area. Michelle Sims, sitting at the back, is going to collate the questions. They're going to turn up on this iPad in front of me, and then I'm going to preside over the questions. So that's how it's going to work. So I think that's the only introductions I need to do. So first, it gives me great pleasure to hand over this little device here to Rita Zagul from the High Ambition Coalition. And so she's going to explain what the High Ambition Coalition is and how it relates, or how their work relates to conservation spatial planning. Thank you very much, Rita. So you could either stand at the lectern or you can do it from here, your choice.
I can do it from here.
I think so, but maybe it's better to go to the lectern.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Rita, as was mentioned by Neil. It's my pleasure to present to you the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People. We will be starting with a bit of a less technical, more political side of the equation, and I will give you a bit of an overview of what the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People have been doing so far, and what is this new phase going to be focusing on. So the High Ambition Coalition is an interregional group of 117 countries that was launched in 2021. We had as a main objective, the coalition was focusing on ensuring the adoption of the goal of protecting at least 30% of the planet's land and at least 30% of the planet's ocean by 2030. This was a goal that really started back in 2019 during the climate summit that was called by the United Nations Secretary General. And that's where it was kind of the first time that the idea of creating a coalition of countries from different regions came together. It was launched by Costa Rica and France as the co-chairs, and it was only 5 countries at the beginning, and when we got to the COP, it was 116 countries, and since then we've had 1 more country that have joined. And so very much the work that we were focusing on in the first phase was really to try to work on 2 different tracks. One was related into the political mobilization, and that political track, engaging with ministers, making sure that we really put the importance of biodiversity and halting and reversing the biodiversity loss at the highest level. So it was mainly trying to bring this idea and really trying to put this topic at the highest level. And so we engaged throughout since 2019 until 2022 in the different international and multilateral events. So basically the United Nations General Assembly and different international events. At the same time, we were also engaging at a technical level with the different focal points from the countries. And so an important issue to highlight is really the fact that because it was an interregional coalition and it had so many different countries, we were able to really bring together the different points of view of the different regions. And this was really the first time that it happened in the negotiations of the CBD. And so mainly what we wanted to do back then, and we want to continue on doing this, is really to share the different experiences from countries and make sure that we share best practices in order to be able to advance and really accelerate the action. So when we got to the negotiations, we managed to really make sure that we highlighted several elements of the coalition's aim, which was basically the 30 by 30 is not only for us a numerical value. We're not only making sure that we didn't want to make sure only that we have the area coverage, but also to make sure that it really had the qualitative elements included. So we really fought for making sure that the qualitative elements were also reflected. So making sure that we had representativity, connectivity, equitable governance, and other elements included within the Target 3. Another very important element for the coalition, and we really worked on in the first phase, was the involvement of indigenous peoples and local communities. And this was something that we really strived for since the beginning. So we created a task force within the High Ambition Coalition that was focused on really trying to connect the views of indigenous peoples and local communities. And a way of doing that was to engage with the Indigenous Forum for Biodiversity, the International Indigenous Forum for Biodiversity, the IIFB. And so we partnered with them since the beginning, and we had bi-monthly meetings in order to make sure that all the language that we would be pushing for would be in coordination with the main values also and the ideas of IPLCs. Why did I want to start with all that? I think it's important for you to know a bit about the history of the High Ambition Coalition and where we're moving towards, because I think that in the case of the High Ambition Coalition, we really much focus solely on Target 3. And since we only have, I think it's even less than 7 years now, we really need to scale up our efforts and make sure that we are moving and collaborating together in the upcoming 6 years and a half. And so this new phase of the coalition is really focusing on the action and the implementation. And so we would be focusing on 4 main areas. One is continuing with the strengthening of the political engagement, so to continue on putting at the agenda at the highest level the importance of biodiversity, of conservation, of the 30 by 30, making sure that in the different international meetings and events we are there and we really have this signal of the political momentum. And then the other 3 tools that we are developing at this moment are really focused on making sure that the members of the coalition are able to achieve this goal by 2030. So we really felt this need and this responsibility to make sure that countries not only fought in order to make sure that this goal was adopted at the Kunming-Montreal biodiversity framework, but that we actually support them also in the implementation phase. So the 3 other tools that we are developing are, one is mainly focusing on providing capacity building and knowledge platform. So basically we're working together with IUCN, WCPA, and with TNC, making sure that we have as much information as we can, as much guidance as we can in one single place. So that's the first one. And the other 2 are really matchmaking platforms. One matchmaking platform is focused on the financial matchmaking. So it's really mapping the different finance that is available and trying to make sure that countries are really understanding where this finance is coming from and how to access it. And the fourth main objective of this new phase is really to support countries with the technical matchmaking and trying to make sure that they have the necessary support in order to be able to really map the different expertise that is out there and how to access it in order to be able to move forward as fast as possible. I think one of the main aims as well of the coalition is to really try to make sure that the different best practices and good experiences from other countries are shared amongst the HAC members, because really what we have discovered is in many cases, many of the questions that a country has, even if it's in a different region, it applies also for another region, and having the good experiences and those best practices really accelerate the action. And so we need to be able to make sure that those experiences and that those actions are really shared in a way. We managed, I would say, to have this collaboration and this really camaraderie amongst the HAC members for the first phase, and our idea is to maintain that for this new phase. I think this is a very small snapshot of the work that we've been doing, and I know that I don't have much more time, but I really wanted to share with you the work that has been done from the High Ambition Coalition, and mainly focusing on Target 3. I know that this goes a bit beyond Target 3, but this is kind of the main aim and the main focus of the coalition. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rita. So please, if you do have questions for Rita, try to send them in through the Slido app, or send them to Michelle somehow if you know her email. So we're going to compile the questions, so that's one thing to say. The second thing to say is that the HAC country membership, the spatial planning kind of that those countries will do, there is now a consortium of people, philanthropy, starting to support those processes in countries. So countries are being identified and helped. So there are funders coming through on that. And that builds off work done under something called Spaces, which was a technical first phase, and the second phase will be country level support. And I'm going to hand over seamlessly to Lara, who's going to talk about the first phase of Spaces work and maybe a tiny bit of how it links into the HAC work.
Thank you very much, Neil. So, as Neil says, my name's Lara Miles. I come from the UNEP World Conservation Monitoring Centre in the UK, and I sit in the nature-based solutions team there. Much of our experience is in supporting countries to think about forests and climate and spatial planning to make sure that action on forests for climate is also delivering for people, for biodiversity, for ecosystem services. But I'm here today to talk about the work on spaces, as Neil said. But to start off, just to go back to thinking about why it's important to consider climate objectives when we're thinking about biodiversity action and vice versa. We did some work in collaboration with the partners that you see on the screen below here to look at, as we as a world were identifying what the global biodiversity framework was going to look like and what the targets within there would say and what the level of ambition would be under the global biodiversity framework. We did some work to identify what the climate change mitigation benefits of specific biodiversity targets might look like. So we examined a 30% target for conserved and protected areas and a 15% target for restoration that was really focused on the restoration of converted lands back to natural ecosystems. And through a rather detailed analysis that looked at what the land conversion would have been in the future according to integrated assessment models in the absence of conservation action, we identified that there was indeed a substantial climate change mitigation potential, both from the conservation and the restoration actions here. For conservation, we used essentially a globally optimized set of areas that would protect both biodiversity and carbon stocks effectively that had been developed in a previous collaboration called NatureMap, and similarly for restoration, looking at places that would restore both biodiversity and carbon stocks effectively. And for conservation, we identified that around 40 gigatons of carbon dioxide by 2050 could be avoided, avoided emissions, plus 22 gigatons from the sequestration side of restoration. And on the emissions, that represents about a third of all the emissions that we might have seen from land cover change over the same period. So it's substantial, but it's not by itself enough to tackle the whole problem. You know, the biodiversity targets are a big part of the picture, but we also need to be looking at tackling emissions from managed lands and emissions from the oceans, which we didn't even tackle in this analysis. But you know, we can see that there's a significant contribution here. And similarly, in our climate actions, we need to be thinking about delivering biodiversity benefits. So we were fortunate enough to have support from the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation last year to spend some time thinking about what the needs and opportunities were for using spatial intelligence to better foster action on nature and climate that was complementary. And we spent time thinking about business needs and country needs and some of the technical underpinnings, and prepared a whole series of outputs, some of which you can already access online, some of which will be available shortly. I'm only going to be able to draw on a little bit of that whole year's work by a fantastic team of people during this presentation, but just to give you some of the highlights. For business, we worked with the World Economic Forum Global Futures Council on Nature-Based Solutions, which is co-chaired by Corley Pretorius, who's here today, and Guido Schmidt-Traub from Systemic. I should have said, this Spaces phase was co-convened by UNEP WCMC and Systemic working together. And we had a range of recommendations coming out from that discussion, which were published in this Location Matters report from the World Economic Forum. First of all, exploring what the business needs for spatial intelligence in this space might be, which are a whole range of steps from understanding what the risks and opportunities for business might be, you know, both thinking about the risks that business activities pose to nature, but also the dependencies on nature of everything that we do. We thought about how spatial intelligence is important, and by spatial intelligence I mean understanding the data, using analysis to inform your decision making, visualizing the results of that data and analysis so that decisions can be informed both for business and for countries. So spatial intelligence, useful for understanding the risks and opportunities, useful for setting, tracking and disclosing progress towards targets, and useful for making the case for green finance. It's also fundamental to building better engagement with other stakeholders, such as local communities, such as governments. If everybody's looking at and understanding the same map, you're at least starting off on the same page. And business needs to understand what the risks are in its supply chains, so that they're kind of getting ahead of the curve and making sure that they have tackled those risks to nature before they start receiving bad publicity and external scrutiny of these things. So Global Futures Council made several recommendations on action. On the business side, that they should be investing in expertise and spatial data and deploying that throughout their operations. That it's time to develop nature-positive strategies and to integrate these with net zero strategies that many businesses already have. And not to wait, to take action now, both on developing commitments, underpinning those with the best available spatial data, investing in nature-based solutions, for example, on restoration within lands that they hold, working with the task force on nature-related financial disclosure, or efforts such as the Science-Based Targets Network to pilot ways of setting targets and monitoring those targets. And on the government side, they can support business by making their plans, their development plans, their nature and climate plans spatially explicit, so it's clear what the objectives are in different places. Embedding spatial intelligence in policy and standards, and in particular promoting access to data that's been gathered because there are regulatory reasons to do so, such as environmental impact assessment or government-held data. And again, aiming for integrated action on nature and climate, whether that's through policy coherence, making sure that people are on board and that planning is inclusive, taking the advantage of new technologies, and promoting commercial opportunities by putting the right incentives in place so that business are encouraged to do the right thing. We also took a look at work within different countries. I'm going to skip forward to say that there was similarly a set of recommendations on what we found from country evidence led to an effective spatial planning exercise for nature and climate. So it's helpful to have the highest levels of government, senior decision makers, being behind the effort so that everybody knows that they've got a mandate to get on with working together against a clear unified set of goals. It's helpful to be using the same data sets across different ministries or agencies, so again that people are starting from the same place in their discussions. But it's not just about analysis and data. You can only have a successful planning process if people are on board, and that means an inclusive process that engages the right stakeholders in the right places throughout. And then finally, an enabling institutional context is needed to ensure that there is a plan that gets off the shelf, that it's not just about having a map, but that map is enabled to take shape in reality. We looked at principles for inclusive spatial planning, which really does mean recognizing that Indigenous peoples have already internationally agreed rights and making sure that those rights are realized in reality, that people are meaningfully included from the earliest opportunity of spatial planning, that solutions are involving the solutions that are put forward are determined by the people who are living in those landscapes rather than being suggested to them and only involving a process of free, prior and informed consent. We ought to be going beyond consent to Indigenous and local community determined actions. We need a comprehensive, when we're talking about protected areas, we need a comprehensive definition that is including other effective conservation measures, Indigenous community and conserved areas, Indigenous territories, thinking broadly about the benefits of conservation. And in doing so, integrating, many of us from a science background, we need to integrate diverse worldviews, ethics, spiritual beliefs, and understand that those have equal value and often cannot readily be represented on a map that's derived from top-down satellite data. I am massively running out of time to go through these slides, so I'm going to skip straight to the end. There's plenty more that I'm happy to talk to you about afterwards. We did some fantastic work on global data sets, but skipping through to what comes next. So, overwhelmingly, most of the countries in the world have signed up to implementing the Global Biodiversity Framework and now have to think about what that means in practice. And as Rita was saying, we don't have long. 2030 is coming up upon us very rapidly. Target 1 is all about spatial planning and other effective management. Target 2, restoration. Target 3, conservation. Target 8, nature-based solutions. If countries can think about these things together, they stand a good chance of achieving the kinds of multiple benefits across the sustainable development goals that we're all hoping for. But it's not just about spatial planning. It's also about making sure that the frameworks and the funds are in place to enable those plans to spring into life. And we're hoping to work with countries in the coming years to support them both on that spatial planning and on identifying ways to finance the actions that we're also desperately hoping for. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Lara. We're going to move on now to a sort of a linked part of the story. So we've had the policy, and we've had the spaces background analysis and pieces, and now we're going to move to UNDP, Di Zhang, who's going to tell us about one of the tools which exists. It's linked to the UN Biodiversity Lab, which is a data platform. This is a country-level spatial planning tool, which is embedded in that UN Biodiversity Lab tool. And the idea is to be able to provide countries with a tool that they can use for spatial planning to achieve targets 1, 2, 3, 8 under Global Biodiversity Framework and carbon-related targets as well. So over to Dee.
Thank you, Neil and Lara, for setting the scene. I'm too short for the monitor, so excuse me, I'll stand here. Great. I will skip Lara's slide here. Hi, everyone. My name is Di Zhang. I work for UNDP as a spatial planning and biodiversity expert on the Global Program for Nature and Development. Today is my great pleasure to share with you a country-level spatial planning approach, ELSA. By ELSA, the full name is actually Essential Life Support Areas. Not that has anything to do with the Disney princess. The project is also referred to as Mapping Nature for People and Planet. At UNDP, we're pioneering a process that allows decision makers to map their national essential life support areas to determine where nature-based actions can preserve our ecological safety net while simultaneously achieving national development goals. With that summary, in the next few minutes, I will cover a brief introduction of the ELSA project and ELSA methodology, the application of ELSA in many countries, as well as our ambitious scaling up plan to enable ELSA for any country in the world. As mentioned by Lara just now, spatial intelligence will be foundational as countries determine how and where to take actions to safeguard nature. As a step one, UNDP, together with UNOP WCMC, UNOP, and the Secretary of CBD, created the UN Biodiversity Lab to support policymakers and basically anyone in the world, all of you in this room, with the access to many of the world's best spatial data on nature, climate, and sustainable development. It is a free, open source environment that doesn't require any previous GIS experience. The launch of UNBL has substantially doubled the number of spatial data used between countries' 5th national report and 6th national report. There, we see a great potential of spatial data and tools to help countries develop policy-focused and more data-driven sustainable development solutions. What if country had a way to protect, restore, and manage nature that have the greatest impact not only on biodiversity, but also on climate and sustainable development goals? This is the question ELSA is trying to answer. ELSA is a spatial planning approach, but more than that. There should be some animation on my slide, but sorry about that. As you can see on this slide, there is 3 components in the ELSA process, starting from really understand the national needs. A wide range of national stakeholders and policymakers across different departments will sit together to generate a national vision and identify the priority policy commitment for the country. Then the ELSA science team will put all these policy targets together on the spatial map to map where can they achieve the policy target on the land. And then with advanced spatial planning tools, we will co-create ELSA map together. The full project circle also involves mainstreaming ELSA results. And there, we will use the output of ELSA to help countries making national development plans and relevant national policies. ELSA is an integrated spatial planning approach not only for biodiversity, but also climate and local people. Once we have these broader planning goals together, we're trying to integrate them into single action plans for protection, restoration, and sustainable management. Optionally, a 4th action on urban greening. We're trying to maximize all these objectives and locate nature-based actions in the most effective way across the country. In the ELSA analysis, we used best available national data and global data to create a series of maps that help identify opportunities for nature, for example, key areas for species and threatened ecosystems, and opportunities for sustainable development for human well-being, like water security, disaster risk reduction, and food security. Then the ALSA science team will build this straightforward user interface that even non-technical expert can engage with. There, they will determine the key parameters in the ALSA analysis, and we will co-create the ALSA map in real time in a consultation workshop. Above is the ALSA methodology. What we're doing is special. By the time ALSA first started, it was the only process that does near real-time systematic conservation planning for multiple actions, multiple objectives, with no technical requirements for stakeholders to engage in. As a core output, the ALSA action map clearly shows where action could deliver across national priority commitments. For example, in this map from Cambodia, green are areas that could be protected for biodiversity, blue are areas that should be restored, and orange are agricultural land to be managed climate smart way and sustainably. All these areas are within a certain budget. With this approach, the ALSA project are welcomed by many countries in the world and are bringing positive impact to their national development plans. Starting from Costa Rica, we then worked with 12 other countries across the world to customize their essential life support areas. And this is how these countries are putting their priority development plans on the maps that are inclusive of biodiversity. In Uganda, for example, ALSA map has identified where nature-based actions could support disaster risk reduction. This provides a firm foundation for Uganda's third national development plan. Then in Costa Rica, the ALSA map is used to inform actions on climate change adaptation. This includes $100 million payments for environmental service program. By completing an ALSA map, this is also a solid approach to support GBF Target 1 on land use planning. It can also support Target 2 and Target 3 on protected areas and restoration, and many more. Now this sparked a new question in our minds. What if we could create an ALSA map for any country in the world? At the very end of my presentation, I couldn't help but to share this exciting scaling up plan of ALSA. Last year, with the support of Golden and Betty Moore Foundation, we have launched a proof of concept that will enable countries to map their own essential life support areas through this straightforward interface on the UN Biodiversity Lab. This is currently available for 4 countries, and we are securing more funding to expand this approach to any country in the world. With this ALSA technology, countries are able to map their own essential life support areas without any technical barriers. And if you're interested to know more, please feel free to contact us, and we will also have an exhibitor table of the UN Biodiversity Lab in the marketplace where I can demonstrate the proof of concept of ALSA starting from tomorrow. And you're very welcome to come by and visit. With that, I will say thank you and hand the floor back to Neil.
Thank you very much, Dee. That was really a nice example of technology being used with countries. So just a little bit more information on that. So the UN Biodiversity Lab is in the process of being moved inside the systems managed by UNEP WCMC. So we will have that whole package of a tool being managed inside our systems, but also then in collaboration with UNDP and the CBD Secretariat. And we're hoping to then work to make it even more country-facing, even more country-friendly, so that a country can go in there, use their own data and the globally available data inside the system at the moment to develop these conservation plans So that's our vision, that this is a major support to countries around the world to implement the Global Biodiversity Framework and other things. You can also use it at finer scales, bigger scales, but our focus is going to be on country implementation. So having said the word countries quite a lot, the next two talks are going to be much more about country level, but to be fair to Edison, I'm going to go through the process of trying to get the translation working for as many people as possible. So if you are on the system, on the program app, and if you have opened up this session, you will see at the top of that session a semi-live feed of myself talking at the moment. So if you can see me on a little box at the top, that's a good sign. And then if you then go to the bottom right-hand side, you can see some headphones. If you click on the headphones, you can choose the language you want to hear it in. You're going to need your own headphones. I've been given some, so I'm hoping they're going to work. But I assume mine is clicked on English, so I'm assuming that I will be able to hear Edison in English when he speaks in a moment. So I'm just going to give you a few more seconds to try and get it working, so that as many people as possible can hear him. Okay, maybe that's enough. I'm going to put my headphones in and say, Edison, would you like to come onto the stage and give us your presentation? I hope this works. Thank you very much.
Terima kasih moderator atas kesempatan yang diberikan kepada saya. Saya akan menyampaikan materi tentang kebijakan satu peta di daerah kami Papua Provinsi dan review izin sawit penggunaan lahan. Ya, nama saya Edison Hoai. Saya bekerja pada local government Bapeda Provinsi Papua. Materi yang disampaikan ini ada 3 kategori. Yang pertama berkaitan dengan kebijakan satu peta, yang kedua review izin sawit, dan yang ketiga spatial planning atau rencana tata ruang. Ya, yang pertama berkaitan dengan kebijakan himbauan komitmen dunia internasional dan direspon baik oleh pemerintah Indonesia, pemerintah kami, maka kebijakan satu peta adalah upaya untuk meminimalisir penyalahgunaan dan pemanfaatan yang maksimal tentang pemanfaatan ruang. Lalu kebijakan himbauan atau komitmen internasional adalah bagaimana komitmen memelihara hutan tropis. Kebetulan Papua masih ada, maka itu yang dilakukan dengan implementasinya review peta dan kebijakan review kelapa sawit dan kebijakan satu peta, serta himbauan tentang upaya tentang penyusunan tata ruang yang lebih cocok dan lebih merespon kebijakan dunia dan masyarakat lokal. Ya, yang pertama berkaitan dengan kebijakan satu peta. Kebijakan baik dari pemerintah pusat untuk melakukan data tentang satu peta Indonesia. Maka semua sektor termasuk di tata ruang membuat perencanaan tentang kebijakan satu peta. Kemudian yang dilakukan adalah melakukan pengumpulan dan verifikasi terhadap data-data dari sisi regulasi, apakah semua penggunaan izin untuk peta atau pembagian itu apakah sesuai dengan aturan apa tidak. Lalu yang kedua berkaitan dengan izin sawit adalah apakah pemanfaatan lahan untuk sawit itu sesuai dengan regulasi apa tidak. Kalau tidak sesuai maka perlu dilakukan pembenaran, melakukan klarifikasi terhadap hal-hal itu. Kemudian di Papua masa sebelum adanya pemekaran daerah baru itu ada 29 kabupaten kota. Lalu lokus untuk izin sawit dan kebijakan satu peta hanya ada di 8 kabupaten. Dan sekarang dengan adanya daerah pemekaran sudah terbagi juga. Ya. Kemudian dari kebijakan satu peta dilakukan perbaikan-perbaikan terhadap melibatkan lembaga pusat di sana untuk menghitung ruang secara baik supaya dimanfaatkan. Kalau yang melanggar dikembalikan. Kemudian review izin sawit dilakukan ada dua kategori. Yang pertama, kalau regulasi pemanfaatan ruang itu tidak sesuai dengan regulasi, maka dilakukan penalti, pencabutan izin. Lalu yang masih ada toleransi, maka perlu ada perbaikan pemerintah, baik pemerintah pusat, provinsi maupun kabupaten, untuk melakukan sinkronisasi terhadap kebijakan itu supaya ada pembinaan kepada pihak yang memegang izin. Ya, kemudian rekomendasinya 2 dicabut, yang kedua dilakukan perbaikan pembinaan sesuai dengan tingkat kesalahan yang dilakukan. Lalu dalam melakukan ini kita melibatkan masyarakat lokal, masyarakat adat untuk melakukan pendampingan dan ikut berbicara. Karena lahan yang ada kebanyakan adalah punya mereka. Sehingga kita tetap berniat baik untuk menggabungkan mereka bersama-sama dalam meluruskan regulasi dan menyusun perencanaan yang baik. Kemudian yang ketiga, saya masuk ke tata ruang atau spatial planning ya. Jadi kami baru melakukan penyesuaian atau perubahan, review izin dokumen tata ruang. Hal yang kami lakukan adalah beberapa prinsip utama, bahwa provinsi kami sudah berkomitmen bahwa Papua tetap green, artinya 90% lahan di Papua adalah hutan. Lalu yang menjadi hutan lindung adalah sekitar 60%. Dan dalam review tata ruang tetap kami masih mempertahankan jumlah itu. Lalu yang kedua ada komitmen 2100. 2100 itu berbicara tentang hutan tropis yang ada tetap kita pelihara, kehidupan masyarakat sampai di tahun 2100 tetap menjaga kondisi hutan yang ada dengan melibatkan partisipasi masyarakat lokal atau masyarakat adat. Kebijakan pemerintah adalah lewat Undang-Undang Penataan Ruang, Undang-Undang Spatial Planning, itu berbicara tentang melibatkan masyarakat adat di dalam penyusunan dokumen. Maka masyarakat tidak bisa ditinggalkan, tetapi mereka bersama-sama berbicara karena ini berkaitan dengan kepentingan mereka. Masa depan negerinya, masyarakat generasinya, dan masyarakat dan depannya. Kemudian yang berikut, dalam penyusunan tata ruang kami melakukan, maaf ya ini pembicaraan tata ruang tidak ada di materi karena dibatasi waktu halaman, maka saya berbicara ini sedikit di luar dari pengalaman kita. Exercise. Ya. Menyusun tata ruang dalam review kami melibatkan masyarakat karena disetujui oleh regulasi secara nasional. Dalam beberapa kali dalam meminta pendapat atau menyusun dokumen FGD itu kita mendapatkan masukan dari masyarakat, berbagai macam masyarakat di wilayah lokasinya, kepentingannya yang tidak dimengerti secara baik, secara proses ilmiah, tapi bisa disampaikan dengan bahasa bijaksana dan setempat. Kemudian betul-betul baik, dan satu perkembangan baru adalah kebijakan pemerintah Indonesia secara nasional menggabungkan spatial planning darat dan laut. Jadi dokumen perencanaan pemanfaatan ruang laut dan darat digabungkan menjadi satu dalam RT/RW yang ada. Sehingga ini masyarakat adat betul-betul dilibatkan dalam hal ini. Kemudian kami berterima kasih karena luar biasa kebijakan dunia membantu kami. Dari Inggris cukup membantu kami banyak dalam menyiapkan dokumen spasial yang begini. Kemudian secara khusus dalam review sawit, teman-teman dari WRI memberi dukungan yang penuh kepada kami untuk melakukan review yang dan cukup bagus hasilnya untuk hari ini. Dan yang berikut, komitmen dunia internasional kepada kami karena kebetulan di provinsi kami ini tersisa hutan tropis yang masih ada ya. Jadi kami betul-betul berhati-hati dan dukungan seperti ini tetap diberikan kepada kami sepanjang waktu kami masih ada di sana. Dan ya next time pengambil keputusan kami di sana bisa bergabung supaya melihat ini secara baik. Poinnya, kesimpulannya, satu, kebijakan satu peta telah berhasil kita lakukan secara baik, sehingga ada kelebihan tanah-tanah bisa dimanfaatkan oleh masyarakat. Kemudian, review izin sawit yang nakal-nakal, yang tidak ini, dicabut izinnya, yang baik-baik bisa dibina kemudian. Lalu, tata ruang tetap komitmennya the green. Kita berharap, kami di sana masih berharap ya, untuk kita komunikasikan ke depan supaya diberikan spesial dukungan untuk kemauan masyarakat kami yang di sana. Sekian dan terima kasih atas perhatiannya. Selamat siang.
That was great, and I heard every word. So thank you very much to Rita for sharing her working speaker with me, and that just shows an example of real-world implication, the real-world application of spatial planning and actually making change on the ground. I like the word revocation of some concessions. That's not something I hear very often, but that's fantastic. So thank you very much for that. That's really, really impressive work. So we're going to move on to the last speaker, who is from South Africa, and it's Michael Gover, and he's going to talk to us about, I assume, conservation spatial planning in South Africa. Over to you.
Great, thanks very much, and it's a pleasure to be here to present what we commonly know as C+, which is the climate positive land use strategies. So as mentioned, my name is Mike Grover. I'm from Conservation International, from the South African office, and we really started to see that the missing middle in between these different sort of natural climate solutions and in the planning, so we decided to try and tackle that. It's very clear that there's a tale of two systems. We've got the high-level national targets that have been set, and all of the tools that have been presented show us what we need to be doing. We also have a whole bunch of natural climate solution pilots on the ground that are saying we can do this if we change certain principles and we work on these pilots. However, there seems to be a missing middle. There seems to be this disconnect between the national contributions and the landscape level coordination and management, specifically looking at sort of municipalities and local districts. So what is a South African ecologist doing at a spatial planning conference or a lab? It's really because I've been privileged enough to spend the last 15 years of my life with my feet very firmly on the ground in the mud, getting my hands dirty, but also because I did a degree in spatial planning, I have the ability to understand that there are tools out there that can actually help us do things on the ground. So as the picture shows, I'm always keen to get my hands dirty, but at the same time, I need to think about how do we actually translate that up. And don't worry, this rhino walked away quite safely afterwards. It was just a standard procedure of putting a tracker into its horn. They say that you have a short amount of time to get people's attention. So I'm actually just going to do a full summary of what the C+ tool is and leave you with these three notes, and then get on with my presentation so that if the next few slides you fall asleep, it's not a problem. So C+ as a tool is more about the process that we went through. It's a cooking lesson. So we went through a process of taking a whole bunch of ingredients that were existing, a recipe that was there, and we tried it out as a group. The team from Conservation International, from the head office, had all of the spatial tools, but the team on the ground at the local level had the knowledge of how we implement these different things. And together, over 2 years, we co-designed this whole process. And what we're hoping to do is be able to do that again and again in different areas so that people can see what the tools can do, but also make it relevant to the area. The second thing to take away is that local flavors are important. So yes, there are global and national data sets, but there are also quite a lot of data sets relevant to the local area, and even the ground truthing and the monitoring that we're doing for projects can feed back into the models and help us make better decisions that are more relevant to the area. And then finally, the users are key. They are the people that are going to end up using these tools to make the decisions. And so we had to start with thinking about what is the end result and who's going to use it before we even started designing the tool. We came up with a few different names, but eventually settled on C+, which I hope rings true. And if you want to come and talk more about C+, we will have a marketplace booth a little bit later. But anywhere you see that logo, you know that we're talking about those three elements. So it's about the perspective that we can see from where we're at. So in South Africa, this picture is very relevant because that's the perspective that we see. It's about protection, management, and restoration, but that's quite a broad term, and those are broad sort of targets. So we on the ground really looked at what can we do in the local landscape that is relevant and break it up into the kinds of protection, the kinds of management, and the kinds of restoration. So you need to reach our climate targets, but we need to make sure that they have a variety of values and outcomes. So it's all about trying to see how we take biodiversity benefits, carbon benefits, social benefits, increased water benefits, and we mix it in with how do we pay for all of this and which is the most cost-effective to do so. So why did we choose this pilot site? Well, I think probably because it's the most beautiful landscape in the world, but I'm a little bit biased. But secondly, it's because that area is highly researched and there's a lot of data there, and there's also a whole bunch of implementing partners that are trying out these natural climate solution ideas. So it was the perfect place for us to pilot where we had 5 years worth of data. Conservation International plays a role in the policy development, but brings it down to a local level so we start to see what the policies mean in a local context. Secondly, we have these partnerships and relationships with the communities, with the traditional authorities, the governments, private sector, and NGOs in the area, and so getting access to that data was a lot easier. And then finally, we have a lot of the implementation that we do ourselves that came from the policy, so we were set for the perfect stew. We had all the ingredients, we had different kinds of ingredients, we had the resources to cook it, and we had the idea of where we wanted to get to at the end. So, as you know with stews, and I told you this was a cooking lesson, is each way that you make it is about slightly different elements that you add. You can increase a certain thing, and it'll come out slightly different, but it still ends up a stew. You can have different kinds of stews that are relevant to different people's palates, and not everyone has the same, and that's fine. But it's about the process that's important. What we managed to do is take the 6 implementation models that have been running for the last 5 years, and from both ourselves and partners, and we started to prioritize them and use the data both from the financial point of view, but also from the outcomes. Each one became more and more relevant as we went through, and we started to map them out using the tools that, well, the C+ tool, but it's really the existing data that was there from many of the tools that have been shown today. We went all the way through and ended up with the 6 different implementation models, which is all very well, but you actually need to see how do those implementation models fit into what's going on the ground. What's great about the C+ tool is we could take those 6 different implementation models and we could run scenarios for different values that reflected the stated priorities. So if the municipality in that area really wanted to focus on a certain output, we could tweak the model and make sure that social benefits was the important one that was able to happen. We then also had the disaggregated project level costs. So we could also say, well, what is it going to cost for us to implement this at a local level? And what are the values and benefits that we get out of that? And then finally, we started to see the low-hanging fruit. So which are the ones that we can do now with the most amount of impact, least amount of money or opportunity, and the ones that the policy supports? We finally ended up with a place where we could start to produce these kinds of maps. And if you come to our booth tomorrow at the marketplace, you'll see a little bit of an interactive way. It's not just about the technology side of things, but the output from the technology and how we use it with local people. This is a combined natural climate solution implementation map, and it prioritizes which implementation model we should be doing where. But we can generate multiple images like this based on what the people in the landscape, the people in the municipality have asked us for. So essentially it comes down to the final sort of thing. Oop, that's too far. And I take this from Hans Moller, is that when we look at things from different angles, these 6 blind people are all touching an elephant at different places, and they believe that they know what it is. But when we start to look at it as a combined whole and get everyone's opinion on it, we start to figure out what the bigger picture is. So I'd encourage you to spend some time with us at the marketplace. We'll be around, and my colleagues and I are more than happy to answer any questions that you might have, and we can even demonstrate the tool live for you. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Michael. So that was another really good example of sub-national planning using, existing and South African data and existing and modified tools. And South Africa has been a global leader in conservation planning for decades, and they're probably still, out there leading. Other people are catching up quite speedily, I think, but South Africa's still got an edge, perhaps. But real-world application of data and technology, what this meeting is largely about, to make decisions with real people about real places on the ground. I mean, I think that's the general ideal for all of us sitting here, and I guess people in the audience. We now have 13 or so minutes for questions. I have some questions prepared, but I'm not going to use my questions to start with and I don't know if there's anything coming through Slido, but I might just take a risk, and there aren't that many people in the room. What can possibly go wrong? Who has a question that they would like to ask using the old-fashioned way of sticking your hand up? Hooray. And could I prevail upon you to take that, and I hope it works, and run around? Okay, somebody's already doing it. Okay, thank you very much. Sorry. Yes, let's do question and answer the old-fashioned way. Thanks.
Thanks for the opportunity, and thanks for sharing a lot of this hard work. My name is Khalil Kettering, and I am a project manager. I do implementation work on the ground. I wear a hard hat, and I'm out in the field. My question is, do we have too many tools? I hear so many different things that overlap if you drew a Venn diagram of all these tools and the tools that aren't even in this room. And so are we putting a lot of resources, and are we confusing people with too many tools? And how can we better align?
Is that a question for everyone on the panel, or for anyone specific? Everyone in the room. A partial answer for me is yes, there are a lot of tools, and organizations like us make lists of tools and then make meta tools to tell you about what all the other tools do. Some of the tools are very specific to different user groups, so I think they are targeted at very specific kind of user groups. So you do probably need a tool for a different user group, but there is a lot of redundancy. And Crystal said this morning in plenary, you know, Land and Carbon Lab is not another platform. She said it twice, possibly 3 times, and she said it's not another platform because there's already a lot of platforms out there, and I think at least I agree with that. But you do need to kind of perhaps get through the multiplicity of tools to come down with some really core things that people need to use for different user groups. And you know, we don't get together quite enough, especially over the pandemic. So the Europeans are busily making tools, whereas the Americans are busy making tools, and the Australians are busy making tools, and the South Africans are busy making tools, and the Indonesians are busy making tools. It sort of happens. So that's my generic answer. But anyone, nice man from South Africa.
Yeah, I think we do have many tools, but the same way we have many cell phones, and each of them have a critical role to play. They do something slightly different. I think maybe where we can work together a lot better is talk about how you use those cell phones or those tools to get it down to a level that is locally relevant. So it comes down to these sorts of labs where you can see all the tools, you pick which one is relevant for you. The process that we went through was putting a bunch of those tools together and not trying to create a new tool, but taking existing tools and designing a process where people could say, okay, that makes a lot of sense for me. But I think we often put a lot of emphasis on the tool itself and maybe not the communication to the users at the end. And I mean, we've felt that as a person on the ground, you get overwhelmed by the tools and you need to be guided by somebody, and that's important. But it's about the somebody also coming to the field and seeing what is there and saying, okay, now we know which tool is going to be relevant for you, and I would suggest using this in this way.
Does anyone else want to take that question from the panel? Rita, and then we'll move
Maybe
to
I'll
you.
just comment on what has been said already. I think there is a question of making sure that we map those different tools and that we make them available for the different countries, because as I mentioned at the beginning, I think the complexity is that we have a lot of information and many countries are overwhelmed with the amount of information that we have. And I think it's important to make sure that not only we let them know where those tools are, as you were saying, but also making sure that people are able to use those tools. So the capacity building part, I think it's also a very relevant one, and it's one that we will be making paying a lot of attention to within the High Ambition Coalition, to make sure that countries know about the tools, that they're able to access them, but also they're able to use them at a national level and subnational level. Thank you.
And I would say that I think country level planning is different to, you know, planning together with indigenous people in their lands. I think that's a different kind of process, and planning business interventions and supply chain related things is also a very different thing to country level planning. So I think we're picking off different user groups and trying to address them. But nice lady there, I think wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, I'm Sukanya, and I'm a geospatial scientist myself. But my question is regarding the different platforms, geospatial platforms that we talk about, and when we talk about scaling up to really global data sets, the question is, what about the data quality? Why do you think about also releasing metrics on data quality for the different data layers? Because, for example, what you showed, the ELSA tool, and you showed a whole different, a lot of data layers, which is great. But we know that data layers, like a lot of them, for example, the organic carbon content across global, right? Like, how usable is this data for any real world application? And so would it not make sense to also have some data quality metrics associated? Because I've been through a lot of different platforms, even the Restore. And so it's great to have data from Google and all of that and say that we have 100 different data layers, but how good are those for making decisions?
I partly answer, and then I think Lara wants to, and maybe Dee. I mean, in the UN Biodiversity Lab, we actually have a data quality criteria filter. We haven't necessarily applied it to every single data layer yet, but we developed some criteria. So there is a document that has criteria for what we would regard as a good spatial data layer for use. It's similar to the criteria for a good indicator data. So we've tried. I would not say it's perfect. We don't have a percentage confidence that this is, you know, a wonderful data layer, but there are some criteria. Hand over to colleagues on that one.
Thank you, Neil. I think it's a great question, and also I can use this opportunity to comment on the first one as well. Like previously in our survey, we found that even though there are so many data and tools available, policymakers in countries still feel hard to access them, partly because like there are many data scattered among different ministries that used to do their plannings in silos, and there are a huge gap between scientists who produce these data and the policymakers who need to use these data. And the accessible and usable data, especially global data, are often not nationally validated, so they can't go into the national planning process. And in ALSA, in our experience of the ALSA project, we have constant consultation with countries and to make sure the data we used are national validated. So if there are national data available that is more accurately reflect the national context, we'll priority use national data. And then if the national data are not available, for the global data we use as supplement resource, it has to be reviewed together with national stakeholders and go through the national validation process before we can use that to create the integrated spatial planning map. Yeah, I think that's one of the effort we're trying to do, and one is to like making the useful data being accessible to countries, and also like it can be reviewed on the accuracy and the quality if they can be applied for the national scenario, and then use the integrated planning approach to bring all the ministries and different stakeholders together to cooperate on these data to walk across the silos. And hope that answers your question.
So to chip in a little more, the couple of slides I skipped over, we're talking about some work that we did again under Spaces last year to look at global data sets and understand, first of all, what the opportunities and barriers to using those global data at national or subnational scale are. And I guess one thing critical to communicate to global data developers is that people from individual countries aren't being stubborn when they're saying, actually, we're going to decline to use this global data set. There are a whole range of reasons why the global data might not be fit for purpose. So we went through a process of applying some essential biodiversity data fitness criteria to assess global data sets, and then added on a couple of criteria to think in addition about whether those data were, as well as being fit for global use, so summarizing what's happening across the world, comparing between countries, whether they're suitable for national use, which includes questions around scale. It includes questions around the fitness to the national policy framework. So we developed a workflow to help a national data user think through whether a particular data set was going to be relevant for them. And the kinds of questions that you're asking there include, does it fit my national definition? Is it freely available for use? Is it well documented so that I can understand how this data has been developed and make a case that it's something that we should be able to trust in country? Is it consistent with what national regulation says we ought to be using? And very often the first answer is there a national data set that we can use? We only want to turn to global data if there's a gap within the national data provision. So for global data developers, the kind of key messages are: make sure that your data and your process is really well documented, that you're using the best metadata standards, that you can commit to continuing to provide those same data so that if a country starts to rely on it, they know that they're going to be able to continue to rely on it. And that you're documenting your methods so that if a country wants to do something similar, they can pick up on your methodology but insert their own data that they already trust to get an understanding of what makes sense for them.
Sorry, we couldn't hear you.
So I was just like, or if it's useful, to have like a feedback loop added to each data layer so that one could really learn across the shared experiences.
I mean, it is one of the really important things for a meeting like this, I think, is that, you can make global data sets, you can, make them hyperspectral, you can make them at 1 centimeter spatial resolution with 20 trillion pixels or whatever, but then you might go to a country and they'll go, well, we've got that one, we're going to use that one. And the conversation kind of stops at that point because the country may well have decided that that's their land cover map and that's the one that they're going to use, and your 20 trillion pixel 1 centimeter resolution hyperspectral thing is like, nah, I'm not going to use that. So I think that's quite a critical lesson for everybody, including ourselves here. Any other? Yeah.
But, well, just to say, Neil, there may be a national data set, and that might be in national legislation, like this is the land cover we're going to use. The global data is still useful and interesting for validation and for looking at transboundary areas where sometimes you can have one country's land cover having a really sharp distinction with another country's land cover. So it's not that those things aren't useful, you just can't expect them to be adopted when there's already a process in place.
I didn't mean they weren't useful. I was trying to just use an illustrative example. But anyway, the question from the floor.
Thank you. It's just to continue with this question about, do we have too many tools? I was also wondering, don't we have also too much data? Like too many satellites, too many gigabytes. Like it's just overloading, and it's not out there in the cloud. It has an actual impact. And we're talking about nature, we are talking about conservation. Why doing so, we are actually contributing to destroy it with mines and all this. And I'm just like, always, I'm working with massive data sets, and I'm always a bit wondering if I should stop, because am I not contributing to the problem? So talking about very high resolution, is that necessary? We are here in a conference funded by the Bezos Foundation. Like, do we need extra fleet of satellites? Do we need that? Or should we actually work together to acknowledge that we should have a limit on what we actually need and then stop there?
That's a big philosophical question. Because I'm old, then I think the conversation has progressed that, we could not go below 10 square kilometer resolution biodiversity maps. 10, 15 years ago, people were vehement that it was impossible to go below that scale and we should stop at that scale. The same people are now producing 1 kilometer, 30 meter maps, which are probably not very accurate, but that progression has happened. And if you watch science fiction programs, then if you believe that version of reality is going to be there, we're going to be sitting there with holograms, flicking around and zooming in and out of things here. And that is a viable future pathway for humanity. How do we get there with the minimum amounts of impact in terms of energy, I presume is what you're talking about, and mining is a philosophical question. Will it make conservation better? I think we're a believer that it will make conservation better, but it's also, if you don't feel comfortable, then you could stop. But anyway, I'm going to hand on to other people because I think that's a really, really interesting question. Happy to talk about it over lunch.
But I think what it comes down to is that none of this is going to work well unless our nature conservation will only be successful if we can also curb the impacts of climate change. And that does mean decarbonizing the global economy. It means that those data centers need to be running on renewable energy. So in parallel to this huge effort that we have on nature, we need an effort on climate. And sure, managing our ecosystems well so that they're absorbing carbon rather than leaking carbon because of our poor management, our land cover change, that's part of the picture, but it's only a fractional contribution to the whole problem. So I can't argue with you there, but we do need the understanding of how effective we are at managing those ecosystems. We need to know whether our forests are not just present or absent, but whether they're being degraded and how rapidly they're being degraded, so that we can get a handle on that part of the picture. So, of all the frivolous things that humanity does, I wouldn't want to chuck out the monitoring of the status of our ecosystems. That feels like throwing out the baby with the bathwater. That's all.
Dee, and then we'll think about whether we should, Dee and one person at the back, and then after that, I think we might close the session, but Dee.
Thank you. This is a great question. Honestly, I don't have a wise answer, but I can share my own story. I think the spatial intelligence and technology has brought transparency, and I will be always embracing more transparency in conservation field and in our land use planning and the changes. So it's like 2020, 2014, when the Global Forest Watch just launched. This is the first time we as the public has access of how our country's forest is changing. And with that spatial data, I first time got a chance to review all these reports from our local governments, from protected areas, and like why on the paper and the numbers it's always increasing. Like, well, our forest cover is increasing year by year, but Global Forest Watch is telling me a different story. Without spatial data, I'm not able to identify where are the differences. And I actually went to these places to see, like, forests did last, and they did happen, like they're burned or they're replaced by rubber forest. So that's how I found spatial data. By that time, it was 30 meters. It's not even like 10 meters or higher. It's already can provide me information like that. And of course, there will be like different cases about mining or open like a Pandora box. But I think with the as our approach evolved, we can find a solution or to discuss that together. But first, with the information is important.
Great discussion, Julian Fox, FAO. Yeah, I really appreciated the questions on too many tools and too much data, because I think we are in the age of being overwhelmed. And I think a critical step we often miss is really aligning on exactly what we need to answer a specific question before we start innovating. So in some of our new projects, well, the Forest Data Partnership, really focus on bringing the stakeholders together to think about, say, deforestation-free commodities, and think about exactly what geospatial data and tools they need first, and then innovating after that. So I think that can save us a lot of time, because the tendency is to innovate immediately, right? And then see how you can retrofit your innovation to answer the questions that are coming toward you. So I just wanted to reiterate the importance of really aligning on exactly what we're trying to do. But great questions. Thank you.
Yeah. I just a final couple of words maybe for me. I mean, there definitely is the user need track. I mean, what is this thing for? Who is going to use it? Why am I doing it? Because if it's not really targeted at a user group, it might not be useful, and a lot of things are not well enough targeted at their user group and aren't used. So I think there's that track, but I do kind of the science fiction program kind of end of the world. I do think that we will make use in the future of, a picture of our planet at 1 centimeter resolution with every possible variable. I think that is a societal goal that's worth having, and I'm not sure who the users of that would be, but I still suspect that that's going to be a good thing to do.
But in the meantime, there's also this incredible focus on, you know, who's going to use the thing I'm building right now for what. I gave you two totally different answers, but I mean, I think that's my personal view. Anyone else from the panel on this one? Oh, another person. Okay, one or two if anyone wants to, and then, yeah, okay. One last one, and then I think we will have to stop. Yeah.
Just to say that I'd love to chat more with you afterwards, because I think we went down that path and we couldn't quite figure out how we how we asked the questions, and then translate it up to the technical side of things. It's on the ground, we have questions that we ask, and a lot of the time the technical guys say, I'm not quite sure, I'll get back to you, and then nothing happens. So it's an ongoing process that took us 2 years, and I'd love to just chat afterwards.
Last question.
Thank you. Just as a technical question related to what you said before, because with the using of technology, we have a very detailed data. So in some cases, I think it's very hard to planning. For instance, some weeks ago, I went to agroforestry in Peru places. They are very small. In 1 hectare, you have agriculture, coffee mainly, and some places about the forest, but very small. So how to planning that? So how to define the criteria, how to define a methodology, no? Is there agriculture land use or is there forest land use? Yeah, this question I want to share with you. Thank you.
Is that something that, I mean, in South Africa or Indonesia, because I mean, there's sort of like very local scale planning, a little tiny patch of forest over there happens to have 5 endemic frogs in it, you need to worry about it if you're a conservationist, but the rest of the land is agriculture. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I think we really, like I said, we used local flavor. So we chose to use local data sets, and sometimes we even used our monitoring data from that specific area to essentially ground truth what we thought was going on. And we also used it to sense check. We got it wrong a few times, where we thought that the spatial land use should be this, and we ran the map, and then we zoomed in and said, well, that's not actually a viable option in that area. So I think it's not just saying this is the option and you must do this here. It's about saying, working with the people, saying, okay, let's try a few different options. So multiple iterations, and as I mentioned, we have the ability to create multiple maps and then interrogate those maps with the people on the ground and say, does this make more sense for you than that? And if so, what was the difference? And then when we started to change, we have a sliding scale of like, is it more important for biodiversity? Is it more important for human well-being? And then you start to see what fits best into the local context. So that's how we did it. Whether we did it right or not, I'm not sure, but I felt as a person on the ground that was the right approach.
Okay, I think we probably are at our time. I'd like to thank the technical team. Very seamless, very good. So thank you very much for the people there for making everything work beautifully. Well done. And I mean, I'd like to thank the panelists and for answering the questions, and you as an audience. And thank you very much for a very valuable session. And I certainly learned quite a lot of stuff then, and that's always good. So thank you very much. Enjoy your lunch. Bye.